So in this tutorial series, I'm going to show you how to make your own billing Wi-Fi hotspot. And I'm going to start from first principles because I've not really seen any videos or tutorials that literally take you from nothing up to a working billing hotspot. I found it difficult to find out this information, so I thought I'd share that with you as I've gone and done my research on this. So in order to build this billing portal, I'm going to use three main ingredients. So the first of which is going to be a Mikrotik router. This is running RouterOS as the operating system, and I've found that this is very reliable as far as having out in the field as part of the hotspot solution. Now this has got 4 Ethernet ports connected to the LAN as well as a port to the internet, and so you can plug in switches into there and various access points and those kinds of things. So as you can see, the Mikrotik Hex Lite is the choice that I've used for this example, and it's quite low cost. So the second part of the solution is the Radius server itself. So Radius is effectively a billing and accounting database, and I'm using a solution called Daloradius that will wrap around a Radius database in order to give us the ability to add users, add billing mechanisms, get statistics and all those kinds of things. Now Radius is not going to be running on the RouterOS, so RouterOS does support Radius, but I want to use these extra features that we can get in Daloradius. So I'm going to be using a cloud host provider in order to host the Radius and the GUI and all the user management. And for that, in my particular case, I'm going to be using a company called bhost. Now you can use any host that you like for, of course, the cloud service. I particularly like bhost because they're very quick to deploy and also quite reasonably priced. Okay, so let's get started. Now the first thing that I'm going to do is to actually get the Daloradius and Radius software up and running on my cloud server. So let's start from scratch, and I'm going to build this up from the beginning. So I'm going to create a new installation, and for this one I'm going to go for a 64-bit Ubuntu build. So that'll just take a few minutes, and then that'll be a blank Ubuntu with nothing on there. So once the OS is installed on the cloud server, I'm going to log in now and start to build up the system. So the first thing that I'm going to do is to make sure that my particular version of Ubuntu's package management is up to date. So apt-get update will do that for us. Now the next thing to do is to install all the dependencies. So there's a number of dependencies like the Apache web server, PHP, MySQL, the Radius server itself, Freeradius, that we need to install. So I'm going to use one big long command just to install all of the dependencies that I need in order to get this up and running. So Apache 2 is the web server, PHP 5. Support for PHP 5 on the Apache web server. The SQL server itself, so that's for the database that's going to store all the usernames and all of the metrics to do with the billing. The SQL client in order to connect to that. This is the Radius server as well, and that's going to be used by Daloradius in order to connect as a database. We're going to be using Git as well for downloading some software. I like Nano as a text editor, so we're going to have Nano on there as well. And some PHP administration software. Okay, so during the installation of this, we're going to be asked a few questions. So first of all, it's requesting a password for the SQL database. It says that this is not mandatory. I'd say it pretty much is. So I'm going to set a password for this. This is going to be my secret password, and I'm going to write this down to remember this for other fields that I might need to use later on. And we're going to configure the PHP administration for the Apache web server, as that's the one that we're going to be using. Okay, the next question is about the admin package. I'm not going to bother setting that up at this time, so I'll just click on no there. And we're done. So that's all the dependencies that we need from the operating system itself. We're now going to go ahead and test that the Apache web server is working, and then we're going to install the Radius tools on top of that. So I'm going to open up my web server and just make sure that I can connect to that externally. And I can see the default Ubuntu Apache 2 splash page. So I can see that the web server is up and running. Now the next step is going to be to get the Daloradius code, which is all mainly PHP code, and install it on top of the web server directory. So the root of the web server is in var www.html on my version. It may vary depending on which specific distribution that you're using. I'm going to use git to directly clone the Radius source code from there. Now that's done, I should have a Daloradius directory, and within there that's all the PHP code to do with the management, the user creation and so on. Now both Freeradius and Daloradius that connects to the Radius database, they need access to our SQL database. So there's a bit of setup that we need to do that. The first thing that we need to do is to launch SQL and create a database that they're all going to attach to. So I'm going to log in as root and specify that I want to enter a password. And this is the password that I entered when I was setting up my SQL using apt-get. So we're going to create a new database. I'm going to call this Radius. I suggest that you keep it as the default of Radius. And then I'm actually going to create a new SQL user. It's not good practice for giving these tools access as roots to the database, but we want to create a local user and just give that local user access to this Radius database within SQL. So I'm going to create the user. I'm going to set a password here that we need to remember. So I'm going to set mine to radius0123. So I'll make a note of that. We're going to use that later on as well. And this line here will allow the Radius user access to all aspects of the Radius database. Now that we've created that blank database, we need to populate that with the correct fields, and there's a script that automatically does that for us. So we can just type in MySQL. We're going to work on the Radius table, and we're going to grab a script that's in our Daloradius download that we did via Git. It's in the contrib directory. There's this file here. So we're going to our SQL password again for the root user, and that's automatically set the table up for us. So we're pretty much done there. Now the next step is to configure Freeradius, and this is the step that I've had most problems with in the past, setting the right variables, uncommenting lines in configuration files and so on. I found this a bit error prone, so I've actually created a patch file that will automatically go from the default to the values that we need to set up various SQL counters and enable SQL within Freeradius itself. Please feel free to read the documentation for Daloradius. It does take you through the steps needed to do this. But if you'd like to just get things going and you're using the same version of Linux that I'm using, then please go ahead and do the same as I. Clone this Git repository, and then we can use a patch file to automatically configure Freeradius as we need it. So if we go to my GitHub repository, I've got an entry in there, Dalo Freeradius config, and I'm going to do that from not in the middle of the web directory, but I'm going to do that from my home directory. So let's just do that again. And now we've got a directory, Dalo Freeradius config, and in there we've got a patch file. So I'm going to patch on top of Freeradius, so I'm going to move into the Freeradius install directory, which is in etc. And from within there I'm going to use the patch command. And grab that patch file. And that's gone ahead and patched these following files. So the counter configuration, there's a number of additional timers and counters that are used for timeouts for users. So this is important if you want to be able to time limit users, as well as a number of other settings in order to configure Freeradius to use SQL as a database. Now we need to tell both Freeradius and as well Daloradius about our SQL database, both the table that we've made, the username and the password that we're going to use. So we need to set that up. So let's go ahead and start off with Freeradius. So I'm going to use my favorite text editor and just go into the etc Freeradius SQL configuration. If we scroll down in here, we can see the login and the password here for the database. So the login happens to be correct. I made a user called Radius, but my password is different. In my case, I use the password Radius 0123. And this is the database that we created, which was called Radius, so that's correct. So I'll save that, and that'll be correct now. And as well for the management system for Daloradius, we also need to point to the same directory, and we need to give the username and password there as well. So this is the file daloradius.conf.php, and if we scroll down in this file, we will also see a username and password. So we don't want to use root, we want to use Radius as the username, and the password again, Radius 0123, and the database was correct, that's Radius. So that should be the basics of the configuration setup. We've made some changes to Freeradius, which is already running on our system. So I'm going to restart that service just to make sure that it rereads those configuration files. So this started and it said OK. If you do have any problems, if there's any bugs in any of the configuration scripts, what you could do is run Freeradius with a -X extension, and that will give debug output, and you can see maybe if there's a problem with one of your configuration files. But that's worked for me, so we're good for that. Daloradius itself isn't running all the time. It only runs when we're connecting with the web server. So we can go ahead and attach to that now and just see if everything's okay. So let's go back to our browser, and then in the root directory of the web server, we should have a Daloradius directory, and from there we can log in. Now by default the username is administrator and the password is radius. So let's log in with that and just make sure that everything's good. If you get any problems with not being able to connect to the database, check your username and password, check the packages that are installed, make sure that you have all the dependencies there. So now that we have the basics of the Radius server and the configuration management tool up and running, we'll now create a NAS entry which will then connect to the router board, set that up, create a test account and make sure that we can log in with that test account. So I'm going to go to management and click on NAS first of all. And at the moment we have no external connection for Radius queries, so I'm going to create a new one. Now if your router board has a fixed public IP address, then by all means plug in that public IP address. Mine's going to be on dynamic, so I'm going to give access to any IP address to use this particular Radius server. I'm going to type in a secret here. This is going to need to match what I configure the router board to have. Make this something long and obscure. Just for now I'm going to use hello. And I'm going to select the NAS type to other. That's all we need to do. I've added that to the database, and now if I list the NASs, I can see that I've got this NAS listing which I can connect to with Radius from the router board. Now this database entry is read by Freeradius, and Freeradius only reads this when the service starts. So in order for this to take effect, I'm going to need to restart the service again. So I could either reboot my machine or I could restart the Freeradius service in order for it to read that configuration. So let's make a basic user. So I'm going to click on users, I'm going to click on quick add, and I'm just going to create a username and password for now. Fred with password Fred. There we go. I'm not going to specify any particular timeouts for this user. This is just going to be a regular user that can just log in. So I'm going to click on apply. That's been created here. And now I'm going to test that. So if we go to config, maintenance and test user connectivity, this will make sure that the Radius server is up and running before we try and connect to it with the router board. So I'm going to type in my username and password. And click on perform test, and I've got a access accept packet. So this is showing me that the local connection to the Radius server is working. You'll notice that the NAS secret here is different to the hello one that I was using for my connection to the router board. This is actually a separate connection that's just for local users, that's already set up by default when we install Freeradius. When we connect with the router board, we're going to connect to the IP address, the external IP address of the server, and then use the secret, in our case hello, that we configured. Okay, now all that's configured, let's go ahead and start configuring the router board. Now in order to configure the router board, you can do this in a couple of different ways. The way that I like is using a piece of software called Winbox. Winbox unfortunately is only for Windows, which is why I'm using Windows for this example. If you go to mikrotik.com/download, if you scroll to the very bottom, you can download a copy of Winbox that runs on Windows. Once that's downloaded, you can go ahead and launch the GUI, and you need to know the IP address of the router board. So my router board is plugged into the local network here, and I've just checked on my router to see which IP address it was given. So in my case it was given 192.168.1.131. So the default login is admin. We can change that later on. Now the first thing that we're going to do is to change from the default configuration. So the default configuration effectively has Ethernet 1 as the master, and all the other Ethernet connections connected via a bridge so that they can all access the internet. I don't want to do that. I'm going to use Ether 2 in this case to be my hotspot. So I want to change the bridge configuration in order to remove that Ethernet port from the bridge. So I'm going to click on bridge. This is my local bridge here, and on the ports I'm going to click on Ether 2 and I'm just going to remove that so it's not part of this bridge. Now that's done, the next step is to set up the Radius server itself. So I'm going to click on Radius and I'm going to add a new Radius server. I'm going to support point-to-point protocol as well as hotspot access to this server. And I'm going to point this to the IP or the named address of my Radius server that's running on the cloud. And we're going to type in our secret here. This is the one that matches what I was setting up on Freeradius. Now at the moment the timeout is set to 300 milliseconds. That's maybe fine for a simple service that's local, but this is on the internet, so I'm actually going to stretch that out to 3 seconds. So there we've got our Radius configuration set up. Now we're going to go to IP and go into hotspot. And we're going to create a new hotspot from the servers menu. I'm going to click on hotspot setup and specify the Ethernet port that we're going to run this on. So I'm going to run this on Ethernet port number 2. Now you can set up DHCP ahead of time and the fixed IP address of this Ethernet port, but the wizard will step you through this as well. So I'm going to give this a 10.5 network. And then it will automatically set me up a nice pool of network addresses from 50 through to 254. I'm not going to install a certificate. I'm not going to worry about SMTP at the moment. For DNS, I could set that to Google's DNS. So Google have DNS at quite nice to remember port numbers or IP numbers. You can specify the name of the hotspot server. You could put something like hotspot.local. But if you do that, that needs to resolve on DNS. So I'm not going to bother with that, as that can cause some issues. It's asking us to make an administrator account. This is probably a bit of a hole. I'm going to add an admin account for now, but I'll delete it before this is deployed. So I click on OK. That's now enabled in its default mode. So if I go over to profiles, using this HSProf1 profile for this hotspot. And in this profile, what I need to do is tell the profile to use the Radius configuration that we've set up, both for authentication with the MAC address and as well for accounting. So click OK there. And that should be the basics of the hotspot setup for us. The next step is to test with a laptop just to see if I can connect to Ethernet port number 2 and see if I can then log in as Fred and make sure that that all works. Okay, so I'm on my laptop now, which happens to be a Mac. I'm just going to go ahead and plug in the Ethernet port onto that second Ethernet port on the router. So I've done that now, and maybe we should add the log memory here. We can see the DHCP allocation going on there. Now on the Mac, I'm going to go ahead and browse to an HTTP site, so maybe something like /dot, and we'll see the captive portal kick in because it doesn't recognize me as a user. Back on the RouterOS, let's have a look at hotspot as well, and then just see the active users as we're doing this. So we've not got an active user at the moment. Let's go back to the Mac and just log in as Fred with password Fred. And it's at this point here when I click on OK that it's going to test the whole connectivity to the cloud with the Radius server. And that worked nicely and quickly. I'm now logged in as Fred, as we can see on RouterOS here. There's also a cookie which has linked my MAC address to the user. So if I then connect again at some other point within the next 3 days, it will recognize me still as being Fred and it will automatically log me in. So let's go back now to Daloradius and create another user that's a time-based user. And this is important to test just to make sure that the counter mechanisms and various aspects of Radius are working. This is where I've had trouble with configuration over the last few days, hence me creating these patch files to make sure I get it right first time. So I'm going to go into management and create a new user. We'll use quick add. I'm going to create a new user called Chris. And I'm going to add some additional constraints on this user. So I'm going to say that only one simultaneous use can be taking place. And as well, I'm going to create a maximum session length as a number of seconds. So in this case, I'm going to set the session length to be 60 seconds, which is a nice short time for testing. Obviously, you wouldn't want a customer to buy 60 seconds worth of hotspot time, but this is great and easy for me to quickly test to make sure that the timeout actually works. So I'm going to click on apply here, and this has created the new user, Chris, with the timeout of 60. So let's go ahead and try and log in as Chris. So back in the RouterOS, I'm going to delete my cookie as well as delete this as an active user. So then when I try and launch the page again, it's going to bring me back to the hotspot gateway. This time I'm going to log in as Chris. And it's logged me in this time. But if we have a look back on RouterOS, we can see that there's a session time that's counting down. So this is a good indication that the configuration is correct and we've actually passed the session time information along to RouterOS. So I can go ahead and use the internet up until my time limit has been reached. So let's have a play around here and just make sure that the bandwidths are looking good as we maybe do a speed test. So we can see the session information going on. And we can see the counter just starting to go down here, so we're going to see that we've been disconnected from here. And if I try and log into another place here, this is an HTTPS location, so it is unable to connect. If we go back to something HTTP, then we'll end up back on our portal. I'm going to try and log in back as Chris again. And it's telling me that my maximum usage has been reached, so I can't log in as that user anymore. So that's the basics of setting up the Radius server, of setting up RouterOS, the cloud server, getting that all up and running. It's taken me about half an hour to do that, so it's not a great deal of time to get started. In the next video, we're going to look at integration of PayPal on top of this, so that users can provision themselves, they can pay for the service, and then start to buy a product as if they were accessing a Wi-Fi hotspot.